In the spring of 2019, on the gravel apron outside the Logan County Courthouse in western Kansas, a water engineer named Boyd Geyer told a 53-year-old woman that the ground she had just inherited was worth nothing. He said it kindly. That was the part she remembered. He had a state lanyard around his neck and a folder under his arm, and he looked at the deed in her hand the way a doctor looks at an X-ray he has already read. The creek on that quarter section had not run in 11 years. The map called it intermittent. Boyd called it a liability and told her gently that she should consider letting it go back to the county for the unpaid assessments. 4 years later, in the fall of 2023, the state of Kansas wrote Della Hoyt a check for $142,000 for the very thing Boyd had told her to abandon. The check was not for the land. It was for what ran under it and for what she had done to bring it back. This is the story of the years between those 2 days, and of a single sentence in an old woman's will that nobody but Della took seriously. Stay with me, because the sentence itself is the whole story, and you will not understand the number at the end until you understand the line at the beginning. Della was not a farmer when this began. She was a school bus driver in Oakley who had spent 30 years getting other people's children to town and back. Her Aunt Vesta had worked the home place alone after her husband died, and when Vesta passed in the winter of 2019, she left the good half of the section, the irrigated half with the pivot and the wheat, to a nephew in Wichita. To Della, she left 40 acres of dry creek bottom, a collapsing pole barn, and a sentence written in her own hand at the bottom of the typed will. The lawyer read it out loud because it was not standard language and he wanted it in the record. The creek knows what to do. The sentence said, "Give it back its work and it will pay you. Sign nothing away." The nephew laughed at the kitchen table. The lawyer cleared his throat. And Della, who had not cried at the funeral, folded the page and put it in her coat pocket and kept it there for 4 years. The will reading itself had taken 20 minutes in the lawyer's office above the hardware store in Oakley, and for 19 of those minutes it had gone exactly as everyone expected. The irrigated half, the pivot, the wheat ground, the grain bins, all of it went to the nephew whose name was Glenn, who had driven out from Wichita in a clean sedan and checked his phone 3 times during the reading. He was busy, and he had a life that did not include this county, and when the lawyer read the legal description of the 40 acres of creek bottom and the pole barn going to Della, Glenn's relief was visible because the dry half came with the back assessments and he did not want it. He told Della, on the steps afterward, that she was welcome to it. Said it the way you tell someone they are welcome to the last of the cold coffee. Della thanked him. She had meant the thanks. The 40 acres was the only thing in the world her aunt had handed directly to her, and the sentence at the bottom of the page had been written for her eyes, in Vesta's slow, careful hand, the same hand that had signed her report cards a lifetime ago when Vesta substitute taught the 3rd grade. Boyd Geyer entered the story the next morning on the courthouse gravel because Della had gone in to ask the county clerk how the assessments worked, and Boyd had been there reading the recorder's flood maps for a project of his own. The clerk had pointed Della toward him as a courtesy, the way small towns hand you to whoever knows the thing you need to know. Boyd had been generous with his time. He had spread the map on the hood of his white state pickup and shown her the blue dashed line. That meant intermittent and the gray shading. That meant the well field was in decline. And he had told her, with the patience of a man who had given this same talk to 100 landowners, that the kindest thing she could do for herself was to let the county take it for the unpaid $4,000 and walk away clean. Boyd Geyer was not a bad man. I want to be fair to him the way Della eventually learned to be, because the easy version of this story makes him a villain, and he was not one He was 44, with a master's degree in hydrology from a good university, and he had spent his whole career inside a model of the High Plains aquifer that every honest measurement confirmed. The water table under that part of Logan County had dropped more than a foot a year for 2 decades. Wells that once hit water at 90 feet now went dry at 300. Boyd had the numbers, and the numbers were true. Bow, row, 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 row. When he looked at Della's 40 acres of cracked creek bed, he saw a dying system, and he told her the truth, as his model understood it. The model simply did not contain the thing Vesta had known. Let me tell you about that thing, because it is the center of everything. A creek that has stopped running has not necessarily stopped existing. The water that fed it for 10,000 years did not vanish. It went down and sideways into the gravel and sand under the bed, into what the people who study these things call the alluvial fill, the loose bones of an old stream packed with pore space that holds water like a sponge holds water. Vesta's husband, Earl, had understood this without the words. For it, he had watched the creek his entire life. He knew that the willows along the bank stayed green 2 weeks after the pasture browned, and he knew why. Even if he could not have drawn you the cross-section, the water was still there. It had only gone to sleep, pulled down by 100 upstream pumps, and a bare, scraped, compacted floodplain that shed every rain it got instead of drinking it. Earl had started the work in the 1980s, and Vesta had finished it. They had done something the county agent at the time called, and I'm quoting the man's own letter, which Della found later in a coffee can on a shelf in the pole barn, a sentimental waste of good bottomland. The letter was dated in 1987 and typed on Extension Service letterhead, and it advised Earl in firm professional language to abandon what it called his erosion project, to level the bottom and put it into Milo while the water table was still high enough to make a crop. The agent had signed it warmly. He had meant well. He had been, in his way, the Boyd Gayer of his own decade, and Earl had kept the letter not out of bitterness, but the way a man keeps the X-ray that turned out to be wrong, as evidence that the experts had been asked and had answered and had missed it. They had stopped fighting the creek and started feeding it. Della did not know any of this in 2019. She knew only the sentence in her pocket, and the fact that Boyd Gayer, a man with a degree and a lanyard, had told her the land was worthless. Something in the kindness of it had set her jaw. She had spent 30 years being told by experts that buses ran a certain way and children learned a certain way, and she had watched enough confident men be wrong about her own life to distrust the gentle voice that tells you to give up the only thing you were left. She thought about it for a week before she decided. She drove the bus mornings and evenings, and she drove out to the creek place in between, and she sat in the truck at the end of the 2-track and looked at the dry bottom and tried to see what Boyd saw. A dead system, a liability, a sentimental waste. She could not quite see it. What she saw was her aunt's handwriting and a line of willows down at the lower fence that were greener in October than anything around them. And she did not have the words yet, for why that mattered, but she had the feeling, and the feeling was older than Boyd's map. So she did not sign it away. That was the first decision, and it was the hardest one, because it cost her money she did not have. The unpaid assessments came to a little over $4,000, $4,160 to be exact, and she paid them in installments out of her bus salary across 11 months, $90 here and $200 there, and twice she was late. And she kept the 40 acres that everyone agreed were worth nothing. He had a dog by then, a blue heeler named Tick, that her late husband had brought home as a pup. gray and white with one black ear and a way of leaning his whole weight against her shin when she stood still too long. Tick rode the bus route with her in the off hours and slept in the truck, and when Della started driving out to the creek place on weekends, Tick came too and walked the dry bed beside her with his nose down, reading a story in the sand that she could not yet read herself. The first thing she did was the thing Earl had done, because she found his account of it in a leather ledger in the pole barn, the pages swollen with damp but legible. She stopped the cattle from a neighbor that had been grazing the bottom down to dirt. She did not plant anything. She did not bring in a single piece of equipment. She let the creek bed grow up in whatever wanted to grow, and the first year it grew up in weeds, and the second year the weeds were thicker, and the third year there were willows. Let me tell you about the willows, because Boyd would come to care about them more than anything else. A willow is a pump that runs backward. Most plants take water out of the ground and breathe it into the air. And in a dry country that is a cost, a willow along a stream does something stranger. Its roots build channels, and its fallen leaves and its shade cool the bed and slow the wind. And a stand of willows on a floodplain acts like a comb dragged through running water, catching silt, building bars, raising the bed, narrowing the channel, until the water that does come slows down and sinks instead of racing through and leaving. Earl had planted willow stakes by the thousand, cut from a single mother tree, and Vesta had kept planting them, and the ledger recorded every one. Della read the numbers by lamplight at the kitchen table with Tick under her feet, and she understood that her aunt and uncle had spent 40 years building a machine out of living wood, and that the machine was not finished, and that the sentence in her pocket was an instruction to finish it. Across the road, the conventional path had a name, and the name was Royce. Royce Talbot farmed the section to the east, and he was good at it, and I mean that plainly. He was 38, ambitious, and he had done everything the Extension Service and the bank and the seed company told him to do. In 2020, he put in a new low-pressure pivot system financed over 7 years, $240,000 of aluminum and electronics that could lay water down with a precision Earl never dreamed of. The salesman had come out from Garden City in a truck with the company logo on the door and walked the field with a tablet, and he had shown Royce a projection, a clean rising line of yield against a flat line of cost, and the projection had been honest by every assumption it contained. Royce had signed in the kitchen with his wife standing at the counter, and the first season the pivot ran, it made him a believer, because the corn came in heavy and even and green to the fence in a dry July, and the neighbors drove past slow to look at it. Royce was not foolish. He was the future, as the institutions understood the future, efficient and leveraged and confident, and when he drove past Della's weed patch, he would lift 2 fingers off the wheel in the country wave and shake his head a little, not unkindly at the bus driver letting good ground go to brush. He said it once at the elevator in town, not to be unkind, only making conversation while the trucks lined up. "The Hoyt woman's growing a willow swamp out there," he said, 40 acres of mosquito ground. And the men at the elevator laughed, because it was a small joke, and it was harvest. And everyone was tired, and the word went around the way, words do Willow Swamp. And for 2 years, that was the name Della's life's work had in the county. Boyd Geyer liked Royce. They spoke the same language. When Boyd made his rounds through Logan County to read the monitoring wells, he would stop at Royce's place, and they would look at the data together on the hood of the truck, and the data said Royce was doing it right, and Della was doing nothing at all. Boyd would point at the decline curve, and Royce would nod, and the two of them would agree, in the easy way of men who trust the same instruments, that the only sane response to a falling water table was to lift what was left more efficiently. Neither of them was lying. They were reading the same true numbers off the same honest gauges. The gauges were simply pointed at the deep aquifer, the big, slow body of water that the pivots drank from, and not one of them was pointed at the gravel under a dry creek that nobody had thought to measure since the agent wrote his letter in 1987. In the summer of 2021, Boyd came out to Della's a second time. He had heard from the county that she had paid the back assessments and was keeping the land, and he came. He said as a courtesy, because he did not want to see her throw good money after bad. He walked the dry bed with her. Tick walked between them. Boyd looked at the 3-year willows and the weed thatch and the bone-dry channel, and he said the thing again, in a different register this time, more puzzled than kind. "There's nothing here to save, Della. This is sentiment. I understand it, I do. But sentiment doesn't put water in the ground." She did not argue with him. She almost never argued with anyone. She said only that she was finishing something her aunt had started. And Boyd shook his head, not in anger, in the genuine puzzlement of a man watching someone refuse a kindness. "A hobby's a fine thing," he said, gentler still. And he meant it as the gentlest thing he could say. "Just don't let a hobby cost you what little this place could still bring at a tax sale." He nodded the way you nod at a person you have decided not to reach, and he got in his white state pickup and drove back to town. And that was the second time the word was said out loud. Hobby this time, where the first time it had been liability. And Della stood in the dry bed and watched the dust of him go and put her hand down to Tick's head without looking. And Tick leaned into her leg, and the two of them stayed out there until the light went long and gold across the willows that Boyd could not see the point of. That winter, her granddaughter came. Mara was 24 and had a degree in environmental science from the State University and a job offer in Denver that she had not yet accepted, and she came to Oakley to help her grandmother through a hard January and ended up staying. Mara loved Della and was embarrassed by her in roughly equal measure, the way the educated young are embarrassed by the people who raised. She had grown up coming to this country in summers, and she had left it as soon as she could. And she carried the particular shame of a person who has been taught to see her own family's life as a problem to be diagnosed. When she first walked the creek place, she saw what Boyd saw. She had been taught to see it. She had models in her head, drawdown curves and recharge rates, and the model said the aquifer was crashing, and one stubborn woman with a healer and a weed patch was not going to change the hydrology of the high plains. I want to mark this moment, because Mara is the one who will read the number aloud at the end, and the distance she traveled to get there is the measure of the whole thing. If you have ever come home with an education and looked at the people who raised you as though they were behind the times, you already know the road she had to walk back. I will not belabor it. The story will. Mara's first winter on the place, she argued with her grandmother at the kitchen table, gently, the way you argue with someone you love and pity. She showed Della the state's own data on her phone, the dashboard the agency published, the county map bleeding red. She showed her the decline rate, 1.5 feet a year now in the worst sections. She used the words her professors used: unsustainable, terminal, beyond recovery. And Della listened and poured the coffee and said almost nothing. And when Mara finished, Della pushed the leather ledger across the table and said, "Read Earl's. And then we'll talk about whose numbers are older." Mara did not want to read it. She told me later, through Della, that she had thought of the ledger the way she thought of a horoscope, a comfort for people who did not have real instruments. She opened it that night only to be polite. The first pages were weather, rainfall logged to the 10th of an inch going back to 1981, and that stopped her because it was data, kept by hand, longer and more local than anything the state had for that section. A man who logs rain to the 10th of an inch for 40 years is not a sentimentalist. He is a scientist who never got the title. Let me tell you what was in that ledger, because it is the second mechanism and it is the one the state's model had no column for. Earl had not just planted willows, he had reshaped the floodplain by hand, and with a borrowed dozer across 15 years, building what the ledger called the spreaders. Low earthen sills laid across the bottom, at a grade so slight you could not see it by eye, each one designed to take the rare flood and stop it. Fan it out, wide and thin, across the whole 40 acres, instead of letting it tear down the channel in an afternoon. He had set them with a hand level and a string and a borrowed surveyor's rod, working evenings after the day's other work was done, and the ledger recorded the height of each one to the inch and the date it was finished. The principle was old and simple, and almost nobody practiced it anymore. A flood that spreads thin sinks in. A flood that runs narrow and fast leaves. Water has weight, and water has speed. The whole trick was to trade the speed away, to make the water wander and pool and lose its hurry, because water in a hurry cuts, and water at rest soaks. Earl had read this in The Land, the way Della read it now in his hand. And across those 15 years he had turned a scoured ditch into a shallow, rough, willow-choked sponge that was built for one purpose, to catch water when water came and to make it stay long enough to go down into the gravel. The system had never been tested in Della's tenure because no real flood had come. The creek had not run in over a decade. Everything Earl and Vesta built was a held breath, waiting for water, and the state's monitoring wells, which sat out in the open country measuring the deep aquifer, could not see it, because the thing Earl built worked on the shallow water in the creek bones, the part the model did not measure because nobody thought it mattered. Mara read the ledger across 3 nights. On the third night, she stopped arguing. She did not convert all at once, that is not how it happens, but she stopped arguing and she started asking questions, and the questions were the beginning of the turn. She asked how high the spreaders were. She asked where the mother willow had stood. She asked finally whether anyone had ever measured the shallow water under the bed, and Della said no, because measuring it would have cost money they did not have, and because Vesta had said the creek would tell them when it was ready. Then came the summer of 2022, and the country began to burn. It was the worst drought western Kansas had seen in 40 years. By July, the deep aquifer that fed the pivots was dropping faster than the engineers had ever recorded. Boyd's truck was on the county roads every week, and the readings he pulled from the monitoring wells were numbers he had warned about for a decade and had never wanted to see proven. The corn stood short and pale across the whole county, and the wind in August carried dust the color of the road. Royce ran his new pivot day and night, and his power bill ran to $4,000 a month, and the well that fed it began to suck air in the afternoons. You could hear it, a cough in the pump house, a hesitation in the spray pattern, the sign every irrigator dreads. He deepened it in August, another $19,000 he did not have, financed against the next crop, and for 2 weeks that bought him water again, and then the new depth began to cough, too, because there is a depth past which even good equipment cannot reach water that is no longer there. He stood in his own field in September with the agronomist from the seed company, the same clean truck, the same tablet, and the projection on the screen no longer matched the corn in front of them. And the agronomist did not have an answer except to suggest a more drought-tolerant hybrid for next year at a premium, and Royce nodded because nodding was all there was to do. The corn came in at less than half of what the projection had promised. Boyd's monitoring wells told the whole county the same story. The numbers he trusted were finally undeniably true in the worst way. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to enjoy Royce's trouble, and the niche I work in does not enjoy it. Royce had done everything right. He had followed the best advice available from the most qualified people in the state. He had a wife and 2 kids and a note at the bank, and he had bet the farm, literally, on a true projection that left out the one thing that mattered, which was what happens when the water you have engineered your whole operation to lift simply falls below the reach of the pump. The drought was nobody's fault. The drought did what no argument could do, which was to show, in real dollars and real feet of falling water, the difference between a system built for efficiency and a system built for resilience. Royce's pivot was a marvel as long as there was water to lift. When the water fell below it, the marvel became a debt with aluminum bolted to it. And on Della's 40 acres in the same drought, something happened that had not happened in 11 years. In the 3rd week of August, a storm broke over the divide upstream, 6 inches of rain in 90 minutes on ground too hard to take it, and the dry creek that fed Della's bottom ran for the first time since 2011. Mara called Della at midnight, and they drove out in the truck with Tick standing on the seat between them, and they stood in the rain in the headlights and watched water come down the old channel, brown and fast and full of the upstream's topsoil, and they watched it hit the first of Earl's spreaders and stop. It did exactly what Earl had built it to do. The water fanned out across the willow flat, slowed by 10,000 stems, and instead of tearing through in an afternoon, it sat. It sat for 3 days, a shallow brown sheet across 40 acres, and it sank. Mara stood in it to her ankles on the 2nd day and watched it going down into the gravel, and she understood all at once and against her training that the model in her head had been measuring the wrong water. Boyd Geyer drove past on the road that week and saw the sheet of water on the land he had called worthless, and he slowed the white pickup, and he did not stop, and Della saw him not stop, and she said nothing about it to anyone. Let me tell you what happened next, because the storm was not the reveal. The storm was only the water, the reveal was the measurement, and the measurement took another year. Mara accepted the offer in Denver and turned it down in the same week. She stayed. She used what she knew, the part of her training that was good and true. And she did what Vesta had never been able to afford to do. In the spring of 2023, she had 2 monitoring wells drilled into the shallow alluvial fill under the creek bed, one at the head of the 40 and one at the foot. And she began to take readings, and she sent the readings to the state, because Mara, unlike her grandmother, knew how the state's machinery worked. And she knew that water in the ground had become the most valuable thing in western Kansas, and she knew there was a program nobody on the dry creek had ever heard of. The state had begun paying landowners for verified aquifer recharge. The idea was new, and the money was real. If you could prove with monitored data, the state would accept that your land had put a measurable volume of water back into the ground that would otherwise have been lost. The state would pay you for the storage, the same way it had spent a century paying people to pump water out. The whole apparatus that had been built to extract was learning, slowly and expensively, that it had to learn to save, and it was willing to pay the people who already knew how. Mara filed the application in the summer of 2023. The state sent an engineer to verify the readings and to certify the volume. And the engineer they sent, because Logan County is a small place and he was the man who knew the wells, was Boyd Gayer. He came on a clear morning in September. Della was on the porch with the ledger on her knees and Tick at her boots, gray in the muzzle now, 8 years old and slower, leaning his weight against her shin the way he always had. Mara met Boyd at the truck. Royce came too, because word had gone around, and because Royce had sold his pivot that spring for 40 cents on the dollar and gone back to dryland wheat, humbled and quiet, and he wanted to see the thing with his own eyes. The watching community of One Section Road stood at the fence, 4 or 5 neighbors who had called it a willow swamp and had come anyway, leaning on the wire the way country people lean when they are pretending not to be as interested as they are. Boyd took the readings himself. He would not take Mara's word for it, and she did not ask him to, because she understood that the whole value of the thing depended on his disbelief being satisfied by his own hand. He pulled the data logger from the head well and read it. He walked the 1/4 mile to the foot well through the willows, Tick following him part way and then turning back to Della. And he read that one too. He had a field tablet and a reference table and the state's payment schedule, and he sat on the tailgate of the white pickup and ran the numbers the way he had run numbers his whole careful career. The others stood in the September light and waited while a confident man checked the work of a creek. He was quiet for a long time. He ran at once and set the tablet down and looked out at the willow flat, and then he picked the tablet up and ran it again, because the first answer had not seemed possible and he was too good at his job to trust a number he wanted or did not want. He checked the well depths against the recharge volume. He checked the volume against the schedule. He checked it twice. The shallow aquifer under Della's 40 acres, the alluvial fill that the state's deep wells had never measured and the model had never contained, had recharged over the verification period by a volume the certification put at $142,000. Boyd said the number out loud because that was his job, and then he stopped talking, and the number sat in the clear air the way the flood had sat on the land, and nobody filled the silence. Royce looked at his boots. Mara had her hand over her mouth. One of the neighbors at the fence said something low to another, and then stopped. Della did not move. Tick shifted against her shin and sighed and lay down in the porch shade, and for a long moment the only sound on the whole 40 acres was the wind moving through 10,000 willow stems that had not been there 4 years before. A sound like the sea heard from far inland. Nobody spoke for what felt like a full minute. It is a strange thing to watch a man's whole map redraw itself behind his eyes. Boyd had told this woman 4 years earlier on courthouse gravel that this ground was worth nothing, and he had been right by every measurement he was trained to take. The measurements had simply been pointed at the wrong water. The thing Vesta knew, the thing Earl had built, the thing the sentence in the will had instructed, had been sitting under the dry bed the entire time, doing its slow work, waiting for someone with the right instrument and the standing to read it. Boyd folded his tablet and stood for a moment looking at the willow flat where the water had sat. When he spoke, he did not make a speech, and Della did not make one either. And I am grateful to both of them for that, because the moment did not need one. I had the wrong column, he said, that was all. I was measuring the wrong water. Della looked at him for a while, then she said the only thing she said to him that whole day. Earl knew that in 1986. He just didn't have your tablet." Boyd nodded. He asked, after a silence, if he could come back and learn how the spreaders were laid. He asked it plainly, an expert asking to be taught, and Della said he could come any time, and she meant it, and that was the recalibration, quiet as the rest of it. Let me tell you what they did with the money, because the number was never the point, and a story that ends at the check has missed the whole sentence in the will. Della did not buy anything for herself. She paid off nothing because she owed nothing, having refused from the start to sign anything away or to borrow against the land the way Royce had. She put the money into more spreaders and 10,000 more willow stakes cut from Earl's mother tree, and she extended the work down the creek onto a strip she bought back from the county for the cost of the assessments, and she hired Royce to run the dozer, paying him a fair wage in a hard year. And the two of them rebuilt the lower flat together across that fall, the bus driver and the broke young farmer, while Boyd came out on his own time and mapped the grades so the next 40 acres could be certified too. The neighbors came after that, the way they always do once a number has made a thing real. Men who had shaken their heads at the weed patch came and stood at the fence and asked how it was done. And Mara, who stayed, who never did go to Denver, taught them, because the knowledge was never meant to be kept. She built a simple thing the county could use, a way to measure shallow recharge cheaply, and she put Earl's spreader grades and willow spacing into it. And she did not patent it or sell it because Vesta's sentence had said, "Sign nothing away," and Mara had finally understood that the sentence was not about water rights. It was about not letting the knowledge be taken and fenced and sold back to the people who already owned it. Royce came back to the patient path the hard way through loss, and Della never once said a word to him about the pivot. She gave him work and seed willows and the grade maps, and by 2025 his own creek bottom on the east section was growing up in 3-year willows, and he had stopped trying to lift water that was no longer there, and started keeping the water that came. He named his first stand of willows after Earl, which he did not have to do, and which made Della go quiet for a minute when she heard it. Now, let me pull back, because this is where the story means to leave you. There are two kinds of knowing, and they are not enemies, though we keep staging them as enemies. There is the wide kind, the kind Boyd had, that can measure a whole aquifer and model its decline and tell you the truth about the average of 10,000 square miles. And there is the narrow kind, the kind Earl had and Vesta kept and Della finished, that knows one creek so completely, across so many years, that it can hear the water still moving under a bed that everyone else has written off as dead. The wide knowing is vast, and it is true, and we could not run a state without it. It measures what is easy to measure, and it calls the rest sentiment, and the rest is where the willows are. What the state's model could not see was not hidden. It was only small and slow and particular and built by hand by people the model had no column for. The aquifer was crashing. That was true. And under one dry creek in Logan County, the water was rising because two people had spent 40 years learning to feed it. Both things were true at once. The whole story lives in the space between them. The check was for $142,000. That was what the state could measure, and it was real money, and I do not want to wave it away. It was the smallest part of what Vesta left, and Della knew it, and that is why she never spent $1 of it on herself. What Vesta left was a sentence, and the sentence was right. The dry creek that nobody wanted runs now, most springs, low and slow and full of willows, and the water that comes down, it does not race away. It spreads, and it sits, and it sinks, and it waits under the ground for the next dry year the way it has waited for 10,000. Mara is 40 acres into a life she did not plan and would not trade, and the simple recharge method she built has been certified on 3 more farms in the county. Royce keeps water now instead of chasing it. Boyd brings young engineers out to the spreaders and tells them, in front of the willows, about the column he did not have. And on the porch in the late light, an old woman who was once a bus driver sits with a leather ledger on her knees and a gray heeler, leaning his whole weight against her shin, reading the last entries in her uncle's hand in no hurry at all. The land was never worth nothing. It was only worth something that takes a long time to count. Give it back its work, the sentence said, and it will pay you. It did.